Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be looking at what's called the menstrual cycle. Now sometimes it's referred to, especially at A level, as the Oestrous Cycle. But we're going to talk through, first of all, the basic female anatomy so that everyone is clear on what sort of parts I'm referring to. We'll look at the hormones involved in the menstrual cycle and essentially how they bring about all the changes. And then finish with just a little bit about infertility and more specifically causes of infertility. So let's start here, first of all, with our basic female anatomy and go through the names because we're going to be referring to some of these in this discussion. So if we just follow around from numbers 1 to 9. And number 1, what we have here is what's called the oviduct. Now the oviduct, often referred to as the fallopian tubes, essentially are kind of the pathway for that egg to come down to come and meet the sperm. So the egg will come down those oviducts or fallopian tubes to be fertilised. And that leads us to number 2, which is our ovary, and this is where our eggs are going to be produced. Number 3, and in fact number 7, are all part of the uterus. But we give the different parts different names. Number 3 is called the endo, and I'm just to be able to fit it all in here, I'll put a dash. It's called the endometrium. And it's a muscle lining, and endo means within, so it's that first muscle lining here. I'll just colour it in blue. It's kind of this inner part here. This is our endometrium. So if we just actually jump over to 7, we can put in place what's called the myometrium. Muscular part of the lining. And this whole area here where we have our endometrial, myometrial lining, so actually number 9, so we'll go a little bit off the sync rather than going straight 1 to 9. This is actually our uterus. Now sometimes you see it referred to as womb, but uterus is the correct anatomical term. So we've got the oviduct, the ovary, the endo and myometrium, and the uterus in place. Let's pick up with number 4. So number 4, what we have here is the vaginal canal. And at 5, that would therefore make this the vagina. 6, and I'll just write in another colour just because I think I've written a bit too big. Earlier, I'll just put number 6 in here. Number 6 is what's called the cervix. Now the word cervix actually means like neck. This is kind of like the neck part of this female anatomy. And you've got just here, if I shade it naturally in red here, that part there is our cervical canal. So now just one further label to put in place, and that's number 8. And number 8 is the fimbria. Some little extensions at the end of our fallopian tube or oviduct. They're going to catch the egg once it's released from the ovary. So there's our basic structure, female structure, that we're going to talk about when we look at the menstrual cycle and the separate parts to it. So let's move on. So here we have a very simple sort of multi-graph, if you like, of a few things we're going to be talking about. So at the bottom here, what I have is a shaded red section that shows the endometrial lining. So that's meant to represent the thickness of the lining over time. Now in terms of time, this is a 28-day, typical 28-day cycle you're working to. We have in light blue, estrogen, and there should be a little O, with just the E is the Americanized spelling. We have in light blue estrogen and dark blue something called progesterone, which are ovarian hormones that we'll talk about. And in green we have FSH and LH, which are hormones from the pituitary gland, which again we'll talk about. And at the top we have just a simple pictorial representation of the developing follicle. And again I'll explain the stages that we can see in this picture. Now I'm not going to make lots of notes. I'm going to use the right hand side of the page just to explain what some of these shorthand letters mean. So, the first thing that happens, if I just draw the arrow here, is the uterus lining breaking down. So this endometrial lining starts to break down. And now that bleed is what we call menstruation. Now at that point, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland in the brain secretes a hormone called FSH. This one here. So we have the bleed, or the beginning of menstruation, which just lasts for 4 or 5 days. And we have the release of something called FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. Now that hormone actually stimulates what's called an oocyte, or basically an immature egg in the follicle to grow. Now the follicle in the ovary has many follicles, and in those follicles the eggs start to develop. Now within the egg, or as the egg grows rather, they start to produce a hormone called estrogen. So we can see that as the level of follicle stimulating hormone rises, that estrogen level too starts to rise. Now that has a huge effect on the body. Increasing levels of estrogen in the blood cause the uterus lining to thicken. So that's why in this section here, so I'll draw it in red, we can see the endometrial lining is starting to become a bit thicker. Now, there comes a point when the level of estrogen is so high, so it's sort of around this point here, where the level of hormone is so high that it actually causes FSH production to switch off. It works by a sort of negative feedback mechanism. So estrogen level comes so high that it shuts off FSH. Now that's important because ideally you want to develop one egg and then release it and hope that gets fertilized. So you don't want to be developing multiple follicles at the same time. So high levels of estrogen actually shut off FSH. But it also causes the release of another hormone from the pituitary gland called LH. Now LH stands for what's called luteinizing hormone. That's luteinizing hormone. Now, both FSH and LH are referred to as actually gonadotrophic hormones because they stimulate activity in the gonads, and by gonads we mean the testicles and the ovaries. So now we've started to get a rise in LH, so our estrogen levels have risen, and now our LH hormone levels rise. And they rise up to a point here where we get the release of enzymes. Now those release of enzymes, that ruptures the wall of the ovary and we get something called ovulation. Now ovulation is a scientific term for basically the release of an egg from its follicle. And this on a typical cycle occurs on day 14 of the 28-day cycle. So on day 14 we get ovulation because of LH. And we get a release of this egg. Now, after ovulation, this follicle turns into this yellow body you can see at the top. It's called the corpus luteum. Now, this corpus luteum is a structure which not only continues to release estrogen, hence why the level of estrogen still is high here, so I've just drawn the arrow on the blue line, but you now start getting the release of another hormone called progesterone. This dark blue. Now progesterone has two real functions. It inhibits the release of any further FSH or LH, so again, it has a negative feedback mechanism to the two pituitary hormones. So that prevents the release of any further eggs that would happen to have been developed. But it also maintains the uterus lining. So if you note, when we have a rise in progesterone on this dark blue line, just here, I'll colour it in as a thick black arrow, we have a growth of this endometrial lining. So it thickens, it gets maintained. That's what progesterone does. So you've got the corpus luteum releasing estrogen and progesterone, and they help to maintain the lining. And FSH and LH have been inhibited. Now, obviously, if that egg meets a sperm, you get fertilisation. That zygote, that early fertilised cell, will start to embed or implant into the uterus lining that's thicker, that's now thick, essentially, and a baby can develop, ultimately. But in this diagram, in this menstrual cycle, we're going to imagine if the implantation does not occur, so the egg, let's say, does not get fertilised. The corpus luteum starts to degenerate. Now this would happen naturally, even if the sperm had met the egg, the corpus luteum would still degenerate. So at the top here, we can see it starts to shrink. Now when that happens, the levels of estrogen and progesterone fall. Now, in the case where there is fertilisation, the placenta actually takes on the role that the corpus luteum did, and the placenta will continue to release estrogen and progesterone to maintain that uterus lining. But without the fertilised egg, the corpus luteum just degenerates, and the levels of estrogen and progesterone both fall. Now that would remove the inhibitory effect on both FSH and LH. Now, if you remove the inhibitory effect on FSH, then FSH can start to rise. And we get menstruation again. That cycle can begin once over. Once that estrogen and progesterone fall, our FSH can then start to rise again. Our endometrial lining, we have nothing to maintain it. So the endometrial lining breaks down again, and the cycle just starts over. With the breakdown of the endometrium, rise of FSH, rise of estrogen, the egg and the follicle starts to develop. We get an increase in LH to bring about ovulation. And post-ovulation, the corpus luteum, so the remaining part of the follicle, produces both estrogen and progesterone that shut off the pituitary hormones and maintain that endometrial lining. And if there's no implantation, corpus luteum degenerates, ovarian hormones decrease, and the uterus lining breaks down. And that ultimately is the menstrual cycle. Now, I do get a few questions asked by my students about this, and particularly, so I'll just go through a few of them. So I get asked, at what point does that uterus lining break down in terms of days? So that was really sort of, if we were to write the days in blue, that would really be between day 1 and 5. So it's about between days 1 and 5 is what we know as the period or menstruation. Ovulation, as we've said, occurs on day 14. And if implantation hasn't happened, the endometrium starts to break down at around day 24. So this line here represents sort of day 24 in our 28-day cycle. I often get asked why the uterus becomes thick with blood vessels and more stable during the menstrual cycle, and that's purely to support the development of the fertilised cell. It will need that blood network to provide oxygen and nutrients to the developing baby. And we've already said that the placenta would take on the role of the corpus luteum once it degenerates. One question that often comes up is about contraception and how they work. Now, you can get contraception in terms of pills in many different forms. The common one contains high levels of progesterone. Now, if you have a think back to something I said previously, if you artificially create a very high level of progesterone, that would have a negative response on FSH and LH. So these two hormones that I've mentioned on the right, In that situation, it would shut both of those off. So you have no follicles developing. There's nothing to bring about the release of any egg because you've shut LH off. And you almost mimic pregnancy. You keep that uterus lining sort of high. It's maintained with a high level of progesterone. So the body thinks, in a way, it tricks it into thinking it is pregnant. And so this cycle, in a way, kind of shuts off. So contraceptive pills work by sort of enhancing the level of estrogen and progesterone, depending on which type you've got, to deliberately shut off those pituitary hormones. Now to finish, I just want to mention a few things about infertility, because this often comes up in the same topic. There are a variety of causes of infertility, and this is purely just to suggest a few reasons why someone might not be able to conceive, aside from issues to do with the menstrual cycle. So just really to outline a few. If we think of men, first of all, there could be a male hormone imbalance that could lead to infertility. You could have sperm duct problems. So blocked or damaged sperm ducts could prevent sperm from actually entering the woman. 10% of women actually have immune reactions to sperm, so sperm allergies could be an issue. Or there could just be low or no sperm count, so actual problems with the sperm, or poor sperm motility, for example. For a female, there could be blocked fallopian tubes. So we talked about in the menstrual cycle how if implantation occurs, well, that wouldn't necessarily occur in this situation. Blocked or damaged fallopian tubes can prevent eggs from getting to the uterus and the sperm getting to the egg. Polycystic ovary syndrome could be a cause of infertility. That's where ovaries contain many small sort of cysts or growths that can lead to hormone imbalances and irregular egg release. Poor egg quality can cause infertility. So eggs that become damaged or develop chromosomal abnormalities typically can't last the full pregnancy, and they're usually age-related. Any condition that's usually hormonal that prevents the release of a mature egg from the ovary, including the menopause, can lead to infertility. So just general ovulation problems. Endometriosis, which is a condition where the uterus lining actually, or the endometrium specifically, grows outside of the uterus. So endometriosis is a problem where you wouldn't be able to support a pregnancy because that endometrial lining that you need to implant that fertilized egg cell isn't where it should be. And finally, ovarian cancer. A woman could be unable to release an egg because of having a cancerous ovary, or even ovaries removed as a result of treatment. So there are just a few causes of infertility that often, or sometimes, can be raised when learning about the menstrual cycle. Okay, hope all that helps.